Los Angeles, California, March 15, 1952. In the elegant neighborhood of East Los Angeles, the Herrera family had meticulously planned the most spectacular quinceañera the Mexican-American community had ever witnessed. Esperanza Herrera, a young woman of radiant beauty, with eyes as dark as midnight wells and hair that shone like silk under the moonlight, was to be formally introduced to society at a celebration that had been months in the making. The Herrera family's Victorian mansion, built in 1889 and passed down through 3 generations, had been transformed for the occasion. Colored lights adorned every window. Fresh flowers from Mexican markets filled every corner, and the grand hall had been cleared to create a dance floor that sparkled under crystal chandeliers once owned by Esperanza's great-grandmother. But what occurred that night defied all logic and forever marked the Herrera family with a secret they would carry like a generational curse. 13 men appeared at the party uninvited, dressed in elegant suits from bygone eras. One by one, they asked Esperanza to dance waltzes that seemed to come from another century. None of the guests had seen them arrive. No one saw them leave, but all witnessed something that would change their lives forever. The Herrera family had arrived in Los Angeles in 1923, when Joaquin crossed the border fleeing the Cristero violence that was bleeding Jalisco dry. Like thousands of Mexicans of that era, he had found work in the orange groves of the county. But his entrepreneurial vision and tireless dedication led him to open a small butcher shop in the heart of East Los Angeles, which by 1952 had become the neighborhood's most prosperous family business. Don Joaquin had bought the 2-story Victorian house on Breed Street in 1935 during the Great Depression, when Anglo families were abandoning the area in large numbers. The house, originally built in 1889 by a prosperous German merchant, retained all its original architectural details: hand-carved moldings, oak wood floors, stained glass windows, and a central staircase that elegantly divided the first floor. By 1952, East Los Angeles was practically a transplanted Mexican town in California. The streets echoed with mariachi music from the cantinas. The smell of freshly made tortillas mingled with the smoke from braziers used in nearby factories. And the Mexican markets offered everything from dried chiles brought directly from Michoacán to votive candles bearing the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Esperanza's quinceañera had been planned with the meticulous care that only a prosperous Mexican family of the time could afford. Her mother, Doña Carmen Herrera, had started preparations 6 months in advance, commissioning the dress from a seamstress who specialized in quinceañeras and worked out of her home in Boyle Heights. The dress was a masterpiece of pale pink taffeta with silver thread embroidery, inspired by the gowns of European princesses, but adapted with details that honored the family's Mexican heritage.
The guest list included more than 200 people, relatives who had traveled from Sonora and Jalisco, neighbors who had watched Esperanza grow up, classmates from Roosevelt High School, where the young woman studied, and prominent members of the Mexican-American community, including the owner of the $1 Million Theater, where stars of Mexican cinema performed when visiting Los Angeles. Don Joaquin had hired the orchestra of Don Silvestre Vargas, nephew of the famous Silvestre Vargas of the Mariachi Vargas de Tecalitlan, who had arrived in Los Angeles in 1948 and become the most sought-after musician for major community celebrations. The orchestra included violins, guitars, guitarrón, vihuela, and trumpets, all musicians born in Mexico, but now calling East Los Angeles home. The menu had been prepared over several days by a team of expert cooks led by Aunt Esperanza, Don Joaquin's sister, who was famous throughout the neighborhood for her tamales and mole poblano. They had prepared red pozole with cacahuacintle corn brought specially from Mexico, carnitas cooked in pork lard in enormous copper cauldrons, chiles rellenos perfectly battered and fried, red rice with vegetables, refried beans, and a variety of traditional sweets including buñuelos, churros, and tres leches cake prepared according to the great-grandmother's secret recipe. Esperanza herself was a young woman who perfectly embodied the post-war Mexican-American generation. A standout student at Roosevelt High School, she spoke accentless English but maintained fluent Spanish, learned from her grandparents. She dreamed of studying at the University of California, something nearly unthinkable for young Mexican women of her generation. But her parents, influenced by the optimism of the Eisenhower era, encouraged her to pursue her academic ambitions. Her beauty was undeniable, but in a way that reflected her roots. Light brown skin inherited from her maternal grandmother, deep black eyes from her father, and a natural grace she had developed through Mexican folk dance classes at the community center of Our Lady of Talpa Church. On the afternoon of March 15th, the house had been completely transformed. The main grand hall had been cleared of all furniture except for chairs arranged along the walls. The crystal chandeliers hanging from the 12-foot ceiling had been polished to sparkle like diamonds, and each of the home's 20 rooms had been decorated with fresh flowers, red roses, white carnations, and gardenias whose fragrance filled the entire house. Neighbors began arriving at 5 p.m., the women dressed in their finest Sunday dresses and the men in dark suits and hats, which they respectfully removed upon entering the house. Children ran through the front garden, playing with colorful balloons, while their parents admired the decorations and commented on how elegant everything looked. The religious ceremony had taken place that morning at Our Lady of Talpa Church, where Father Francisco had blessed Esperanza in a special mass attended by the entire extended family. Esperanza had arrived at the church in her father's 1951 Cadillac, decorated with white and pink ribbons, followed by a caravan of cars that included Chevrolets, Fords, and a few Buicks owned by prosperous neighbors. But what no one knew that afternoon, while the guests enjoyed the food and the music began to play, was that the Herrera house held a history the family had carefully kept hidden during the 17 years they had lived there, a history that was about to reveal itself in the most terrifying way on the most important night in the life of their only daughter.
The party had reached its most joyful moment when the clock in the hall struck 9 p.m. Don Silvestre's mariachis were playing Las Mañanitas, while Esperanza, radiant in her pale pink dress, received congratulations and gifts from the guests who formed a line that stretched from the main hall to the front garden. The aroma of freshly made tamales mingled with the scent of gardenias, and the laughter of children playing in the backyard created the perfect soundtrack for a traditional family celebration. Doña Carmen oversaw the food trays to ensure they stayed full, while Don Joaquin spoke with fatherly pride to the neighborhood men about his daughter's university plans. Everything was unfolding exactly as they had dreamed during months of meticulous preparation. But it was precisely at 9:17 p.m. that the festive normality began to crack, almost imperceptibly. Esperanza was posing for photos beside the central staircase when she first noticed something strange in the oval mirror hanging in the foyer. Among the reflections of the lively guests, she thought she saw, just for a moment, the figure of a tall man dressed in an old-fashioned black suit, standing motionless in the middle of the crowd. When she turned to look for him among the actual guests, there was no one who matched that description. "Did you see that man in the black suit?" she asked her cousin Rosa, who had been standing next to her during the photos. Rosa looked at her with genuine confusion. "Which man, cousin? All the men are wearing dark suits tonight." Esperanza pointed toward where she had seen the figure, but among the crowd of guests, she recognized only the familiar faces of neighbors, relatives, and school friends. The first real anomaly occurred when the mariachi orchestra finished their set of traditional songs and Don Silvestre announced it was time for the quinceañera's waltz. They had rehearsed this part of the celebration for weeks. Esperanza was to dance first with her father, then with her brothers, then her grandparents, and finally the dance floor would open for all the guests. But when Don Joaquin approached his daughter with a proud smile to begin the traditional waltz, the music that began to play was not what they had agreed upon with the mariachis. Instead of the classic Mexican waltz they had rehearsed, the notes that filled the air were those of a 19th-century Viennese waltz, performed with a technical perfection far beyond the known abilities of Don Silvestre's orchestra. The musicians themselves looked at each other with puzzled expressions. Don Silvestre raised his baton, but the instruments seemed to play independently of his direction. The lead violin produced melodies the violinist, a 60-year-old man who had learned music in the streets of Guadalajara, had never studied. The guitar rang out with complex chords that required a classical European technique none of the present musicians had ever mastered. But the most unsettling part was that the music was beautiful, more beautiful than any musical performance the neighborhood had ever heard. The guests, initially surprised by the shift in repertoire, became hypnotized by the supernatural elegance of the performance. Some began swaying gently to the rhythm. Others closed their eyes to better absorb the auditory experience. Esperanza began to dance with her father, but her feet seemed to know waltz steps she had never learned. Her folkloric dance classes at the community center had never included European classical dance, and yet she found herself executing turns, bows, and movements belonging in the ballrooms of Vienna and Paris. Don Joaquin, who only knew how to dance rancheras and a few steps of the jarabe tapatío, somehow kept the rhythm with a grace that seemed inherited from generations of European nobility that had never existed in his bloodline.
When the waltz with her father ended, Esperanza expected her older brother Miguel to step forward and continue the traditional dance sequence. But instead of Miguel, a man she didn't recognize emerged from the crowd. He was tall, elegantly dressed in a black suit with an impeccable cut that seemed to belong to the 1890s. His face was distinguished yet pale, with aristocratic features that stood in stark contrast to the warm, hard-working faces of the Mexican-American guests. "May I have this dance, señorita?" he asked, in a voice that sounded as though it came from very far away, despite him standing directly in front of her. His Spanish was perfect, but his accent was unplaceable, neither Mexican nor Castilian Spanish, nor from any Latin American country she knew. Esperanza looked around, searching for help from her family, but all the guests seemed to be watching the scene with approval, as if the presence of this stranger were completely normal. Her father nodded with a smile. Her mother encouraged her with a gesture of her hand. Her brothers looked on expectantly, as if they had known the man for years. "Of course," Esperanza replied, though a part of her screamed inside that something was terribly wrong. When the stranger took her hand to lead her to the center of the dance floor, his touch was cold, like winter marble, but the warmth he radiated was comforting in a way that defied logic. The second waltz began, this time even more elaborate than the first. Esperanza found herself dancing with a skill that transcended any training she had ever received, executing intricate steps that would have required years of classical practice. The man led her with a mastery that spoke of decades spent in European ballrooms of the 19th century. As they danced, Esperanza noticed something strange. She could see her reflection in his eyes, but it didn't show the familiar 1952 ballroom filled with Mexican-American guests. Instead, she glimpsed an opulent Victorian dance hall with sparkling crystal chandeliers, women in period gowns, and gentlemen in top hats and tailcoats. A full orchestra played from a velvet-draped balcony above. When the waltz ended, the man bowed with perfect form and slowly dissolved into the air like smoke caught in a midnight breeze. Esperanza was left alone in the center of the floor, breathing heavily, while the crowd applauded
as if they had witnessed nothing out of the ordinary.
Before she could even begin to process what had just happened, another man approached, from an entirely different direction. This one wore a 1920s three-piece suit, complete with a vest and pocket watch chain. His slicked-back hair glistened under the chandeliers, and though his smile was charming, his eyes carried the weight of lifetimes, like they had witnessed entire centuries unfold. "The next dance is mine, lovely lady," he announced, in a voice tinged with echoes from Hollywood's golden era, when silent film stars won hearts without uttering a word. And so began a night that would forever reshape Esperanza's understanding of the boundary between the living and those who had danced their last waltz long before she was born. The second stranger radiated the unmistakable style of the Roaring Twenties. His suit looked tailored by the finest Beverly Hills craftsmen of that glittering age, and the way he moved suggested a man who had once frequented only the most exclusive speakeasies of Prohibition-era Los Angeles. As he took Esperanza's hand, she once again felt the same marble-cold touch as before, but this time it came accompanied by a phantom scent. A mix of fine French cologne, cigar smoke, and pipe tobacco. "Allow me to show you how we danced at the Ambassador Hotel, when Rudolph Valentino ruled Hollywood." Just then, the music shifted. It was no longer a waltz, but a hauntingly beautiful Argentine tango, played with precision no mariachi ensemble should have possessed. His steps were fluid as water, guiding Esperanza through intricate turns and dips as though choreographed by the finest masters of Buenos Aires. But during this second dance, she began noticing deeply unsettling details that no one else seemed to perceive. The reflections in the ballroom windows no longer showed the party around her. Instead, she saw fragmented glimpses of other eras. An 1880s gathering with women in bustle gowns and parasols. A 1930s soirée with guests in velvet and satin laughing under Art Deco lights. A 1940s celebration where uniformed soldiers danced with sweethearts before being sent off to war. As the tango came to its quiet end, the man from the 1920s faded just like the one before him, dissolving into the ether, leaving behind only the faintest trace of jazz on the air. The applause returned, loud and cheerful, yet Esperanza noticed something odd in the expressions around her. The smiles had turned glassy. The guests now looked as though they were watching through a veil, unable to fully register the spectral performances unfolding before them. From the shadows near the staircase, a third man appeared. He wore the crisp dress whites of a United States Navy officer, the shine of his medals catching the chandelier light. His posture was upright, precise, but his eyes were filled with a deep sadness, the kind carried home from battles fought across oceans, from comrades lost to waters that never gave them back. "One final dance before dawn, miss," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of unsaid goodbyes. This waltz was unlike the others, slower, sorrowful, almost like a love letter set to motion. Each step spoke of longing, each turn a farewell that had never been spoken. As they danced, Esperanza felt tears running down her cheeks, tears that weren't hers. They belonged to women who had waited on empty docks only to receive telegrams beginning with, "We regret to inform you."
One after another, 13 men from different eras appeared to take her hand in a dance. There was a Victorian gentleman in a frock coat and cane, whose every step echoed the rigid elegance of 19th-century England. Then came a sharply dressed cowboy from the American Old West, his boots striking the floor with the rhythm of saloon doors swinging open and duels at dawn. After him, a young man from the Edwardian era, his waltz soft and tender, evoking images of garden picnics and long summer evenings that faded like rose petals in the wind. Each dance lasted precisely the length of a full song, and with the final note, each man would vanish, dissolving into the air to make way for the next. The mariachi orchestra, now seemingly possessed, continued to play music no one had taught them, pieces they could not have possibly known, yet they performed with a technical precision that surpassed anything they had ever achieved. Don Silvestre had long given up trying to conduct. His arms moved independently of his will, as if invisible hands were guiding each musician. The guests remained seated or standing like enchanted spectators, clapping after every performance with mechanical enthusiasm. Doña Carmen smiled with maternal pride, but her eyes, like all the others, had taken on that same glassy sheen. Don Joaquin nodded approvingly each time a new figure emerged to dance with his daughter, as though he knew each of these strangers personally, as if they were old friends from another life. By the seventh dance, Esperanza began to understand. These men weren't simply ghosts, they were something older, more deliberate. Each one seemed to represent a different chapter in the long, layered story of Los Angeles itself, as if the city were whispering its forgotten memories to her, one dance at a time. The silent film actor leaned close to share secrets about Hollywood stars who died young and beautiful. The World War I soldier spoke in hushed tones about the fields of poppies in France, where the dreams of a generation lay buried. The eighth dancer, a late 19th century railroad tycoon, moved with the steady rhythm of steam engines connecting coasts. His hands, though cold like the others, bore the rough calluses of a man who had built industrial empires with them. Through the ballroom windows, Esperanza no longer saw her family's garden, but endless railroad tracks stretching toward golden horizons. The ninth was a Shakespearean stage actor, whose dramatic flair turned the dance into a theatrical performance. Every motion carried meaning. Every turn delivered poetry. Every bow was a verse recited. The air around him seemed filled with applause from audiences that no longer existed, from theaters now lost to time. By the 10th dance, Esperanza had lost all sense of time. Minutes, hours, she couldn't tell which. The hall's antique clock had frozen, its hands unmoving since the moment the supernatural procession began. The guests, still watching, now moved sluggishly, as if time flowed differently for them. The 11th man was the youngest of all, barely older than Esperanza herself. Dressed in an early 20th century cadet uniform, his dance was filled with youthful energy and hope, but also the ache of dreams that would go unfulfilled, of love letters never sent, of a life cut short before it had even begun. The 12th appeared like a figure from an oil painting, a classical music composer from the 17th century in a powdered wig and embroidered coat. His waltz was a condensed symphony, every movement composing melodies that even Mozart might envy. As they danced, Esperanza heard not only the music played by the orchestra, but celestial harmonies from somewhere far beyond, as if the very language of the soul had become song. When the 12th dance ended, he too faded into the nighttime breeze that now gently swept through the hall. Once more, Esperanza stood alone in the center of the floor, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath. She had danced with 12 men, each one from a different lost era, each one carrying with him the memory of a time that had long slipped into the past. But by her count, one dancer still remained. The 13th man did not appear right away. Instead, silence filled the room for the first time in hours. The mariachis had stopped playing. The applause had ceased. Even the sound of breathing seemed to vanish, swallowed by a stillness that foreshadowed something monumentally important. The silence that descended upon the Herrera ballroom wasn't merely an absence of noise. It was a charged, anticipatory quiet that seemed to draw the very air out of the room. The crystal chandeliers no longer cast their warm glow. Instead, they radiated a silvery shimmer that transformed the once elegant Mexican-American hall into something altogether otherworldly, as though it no longer belonged to this time or even to this world. Esperanza stood frozen at the center of the dance floor. Her pale pink dress now shimmered with its own ghostly light beneath the spectral glow. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from a sensation she couldn't explain, a knowing that something irreversible was about to happen. She had danced with 12 men from lost times, each guiding her through fragments of Los Angeles's hidden history. But by her count, one dancer still remained. The 13th man did not appear right away. Instead, silence filled the room for the first time in hours. The mariachis had stopped playing. The applause had ceased. Even the sound of breathing seemed to vanish, swallowed by a stillness that foreshadowed something monumentally important. The silence that descended upon the Herrera ballroom wasn't merely an absence of noise. It was a charged, anticipatory quiet that seemed to draw the very air out of the room. The crystal chandeliers no longer cast their warm glow. Instead, they radiated a silvery shimmer that transformed the once elegant Mexican-American hall into something altogether otherworldly, as though it no longer belonged to this time or even to this world. Esperanza stood frozen at the center of the dance floor. Her pale pink dress now shimmered with its own ghostly light beneath the spectral glow. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from a sensation she couldn't explain, a knowing that something irreversible was about to happen. She had danced with 12 men from lost times, each guiding her through fragments of Los Angeles's hidden history. But deep inside she knew the 13th dancer would not be like the others. The guests remained in place like living statues, their expressions frozen in cheerful masks that no longer matched the supernatural reality unfolding before them. Doña Carmen still smiled, but her pupils had dilated into dark voids that no longer reflected light. Don Joaquin stood proudly as before, but now sweat poured down his temples despite the noticeable drop in the room's temperature. The 13th man did not emerge from the crowd like the rest. Instead, he began to materialize slowly from the central staircase, almost as if descending from another plane of existence altogether. His form solidified gradually and deliberately, allowing Esperanza to take in every detail as he came into being. He was tall and distinguished, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit from the late 19th century. His face bore aristocratic features, refined and noble, hinting at a European lineage. Yet there was something in his eyes, something disturbingly familiar. When he had fully taken shape and stepped toward her, Esperanza felt a jolt of recognition deep in her core, a visceral familiarity that both terrified and captivated her. "My dear great-granddaughter," he said, his voice resonant with patriarchal authority and the weight of family secrets buried for generations. "The time has come for you to know the truth about our family and about this house that has been our home for so many years." His words struck Esperanza like an icy bolt. Great-granddaughter. This man claimed to be her bisabuelo. But that was impossible.
Her great-grandparents had died in Mexico long before her family had ever migrated to Los Angeles. Doña Carmen had told her the stories, how they perished in the violence of the Mexican Revolution. Yet, as she looked into this man's face, she could trace the very features she saw in her father, her brothers, even in her own reflection. "That can't be," Esperanza whispered, though even to her own ears her voice sounded fragile and unsure. "You can't be family. My great-grandparents died in Jalisco before we ever came to Los Angeles." The man smiled gently, with a sorrowful affection that seemed to come from beyond death itself. "Your great-grandfather, Joaquin, told you the truth he could, but there are deeper truths, truths that can only be revealed when a young woman of our blood reaches the age to understand them and to carry the weight of our legacy." He extended his hand, and when Esperanza took it, she felt not just the familiar cold of the other dancers, but a current of blood, of memory, of lineage, a living thread that pulsed with the power of generations. It was like touching the root of a tree whose branches reached far beyond what she had ever imagined. "My name is Don Ricardo Montemayor," he said, as music began to rise again, different from all the previous waltzes. This one told a story of colonial Mexico, of vanished haciendas, of loves that defied death, of secrets passed down through the marrow of time. "I was the original owner of this house, long before your grandfather acquired it. But my connection to this place and to your family is older, deeper, and more complex than any deed or document could ever record." As they began to dance, Esperanza experienced visions that filled in the gaps of her family's history, gaps she had never known were there. She saw Don Ricardo in his lifetime, a prosperous landowner who had arrived in California when it was still Mexican territory. She saw the construction of the house in 1889, designed specifically to host family celebrations that honored both Mexican traditions and American aspirations. But more importantly, she saw the true reason why her grandfather Joaquin had been led to purchase this house during the Great Depression. It had not been coincidence or economic opportunity. It had been the fulfillment of a promise made by Don Ricardo on his deathbed, that one day his descendants would return to the house he had built for them, and that a young woman in the family would be chosen to receive the full inheritance of his legacy. "The other 12 men who danced with you tonight," Don Ricardo explained as they performed waltz steps that blended European elegance with Mexican soul, "were the guardians of this house, the spirits of men who loved women from our family line across the centuries. Each of them left a part of their essence in these walls, creating a spiritual protection that has kept our family safe and prosperous."
Esperanza began to understand that her quinceañera had not simply been a celebration of her transition into womanhood, but an initiation ritual that had been planned long before she was born. The date had been chosen with care. The house had been prepared deliberately. Even the guests had been subtly influenced to ensure everything unfolded exactly as it must. "But why me?" she asked, as she felt her perception of reality being completely rebuilt. "Why not my brothers or my cousins?" "Because you, my dear Esperanza, are the first woman in 3 generations born with the gift to see beyond the veil that separates the world of the living from the realm of spirits," Don Ricardo replied. "This ability traditionally awakens at 15 and must be activated through a precise ritual involving a dance with the spiritual guardians of the family." When the final waltz ended, Don Ricardo did not vanish as the others had. Instead, he remained, solid, present, his eyes gleaming with ancestral pride and solemn expectation.
"Now that you know the truth of your inheritance," he said, "you must decide whether to accept the role that is rightfully yours as guardian of our family and protector of the secrets you've witnessed tonight." The choice before Esperanza was immense. She could accept the supernatural legacy and become the bridge between the world of the living and the ancestral spirit realm. Or she could reject it and return to a normal life, but forever lose her connection to the forces that had guided and protected her family for generations. This was not merely a personal decision. It was one that would shape the destiny of her bloodline for generations to come. Don Ricardo stood motionless before her, his 100-year-old eyes patiently awaiting an answer he knew could not be rushed. The weight of centuries of family tradition rested on the shoulders of a 15-year-old girl who, until that night, had believed her biggest concern was deciding what to study in college. "If I accept," Esperanza asked, her voice now matured by years in a matter of hours, "what will it mean for my life? Will I still be the person I was this morning?" Don Ricardo smiled with an expression that combined paternal understanding with the gravity of someone who had once faced the same decision in his youth. "You will still be Esperanza Herrera, student at Roosevelt High, beloved daughter of Joaquin and Carmen. But you will also be the guardian of truths most people cannot comprehend, the protector of a family that may never know it needs protection, and the bridge between two worlds modern humanity has forgotten still coexist. Your daily life will continue as always, but there will be moments when you are called to use your gift. You will see spirits who need help finding peace, sense when dark forces threaten your family, and at times you will serve as a messenger between the world of the living and those who have passed on but still have unfinished business." Esperanza looked over at her parents, who continued watching with proud expressions, unchanged, it seemed, by the supernatural events unfolding around them. She realized that no matter what she chose, they would never fully understand what had taken place that night. The spiritual protection surrounding the event had been designed to preserve the normalcy of those not meant to carry the burden of such knowledge. "And if I reject the inheritance?" she asked, though deep down she already knew her heart leaned toward acceptance. "Then the spiritual guardians will gradually retreat. The protection that has shielded your family for generations will fade, and the ability to see beyond the veil will be lost forever to your bloodline. Your life will be completely normal, but also completely ordinary, without the subtle magic that has guided the Herreras since they first arrived in Los Angeles."
Esperanza's response rose from a place deep within her soul, a place she hadn't known existed. "I accept," she said, with a conviction that even Don Ricardo surprised. "I accept the responsibility and the inheritance that is mine." The moment the words left her lips, she felt a fundamental shift in how she perceived the world. Colors grew more vivid. Sounds took on layers of meaning she had never noticed before, and she could now sense the subtle presence of spiritual energies that had always been there, but were now consciously perceptible. Don Ricardo stepped forward and placed his cold hand gently on Esperanza's forehead. "With this touch," he said solemnly, "I officially pass the guardianship of our family from my generation to yours. May you use these gifts wisely, protect the innocent, and keep the bridge between worlds alive for when the next guardian is born into our line." Gradually, Don Ricardo began to fade, But unlike the others, he did not dissolve like mist. He transformed into a warm golden light that spread throughout the ballroom, finally being absorbed by the very walls of the house. Esperanza understood he had not left. He had simply taken his place as part of the permanent spiritual protection of the family home. With Don Ricardo's departure, the celebration slowly returned to normal. The guests regained full awareness. The mariachis resumed playing traditional Mexican songs, and conversations about Esperanza's college plans and the family's pride picked up again, as if they had never been interrupted. Yet among the Herrera family, especially her parents, there remained a subliminal understanding that something extraordinary had happened that night. They couldn't recall the details, but they knew their daughter had gone through something that had changed her in profound and irreversible ways. In the weeks that followed, Don Joaquin and Doña Carmen began to notice subtle changes in Esperanza. She had developed a wisdom beyond her years, an inner calm that hinted at access to sources of strength they could not name. At times, they found her speaking softly to presences they could not see. They never asked her directly about these changes, guided by a quiet family instinct that told them some truths are meant to be kept in silence. Instead, they formed a silent agreement to protect any secret Esperanza needed to keep, no matter how strange her behavior might sometimes seem. Esperanza continued her studies at Roosevelt High School and eventually attended UCLA, majoring in anthropology with a focus on Mexican folklore. Her academic career led her to become a renowned researcher in Latin American spiritual traditions, a path that allowed her to use her supernatural abilities while maintaining a perfectly respectable, scholarly public image. She married a history professor named David Martinez in 1975, and together they had 3 children. David never fully understood his wife's unique gifts, but he developed an intuitive acceptance of the times she needed solitude, or when she insisted on changing family plans for reasons she couldn't logically explain. Over the decades, Esperanza served quietly as a spiritual guardian, not only for her immediate family, but for the entire Mexican-American community of East Los Angeles. She helped lost spirits find peace, protected families from unseen threats, and served as a bridge for elders passing on with unfinished business to communicate with those they left behind.
The Herrera home on Breed Street became an unofficial sanctuary for those experiencing unexplainable phenomena. Esperanza never advertised her abilities, but over time, the community came to understand that they could come to her when facing things that reason alone could not address. When Esperanza had her first daughter in 1978, she immediately recognized the same luminous glimmer in her eyes that Don Ricardo had once seen in hers. The line of spiritual guardians would continue, ensuring that the accumulated protection and wisdom of generations would be passed on to future descendants. Today, the Herrera home still stands in East Los Angeles, now home to the 4th generation of the family. Neighbors occasionally report seeing strange lights through the windows on nights of celebration, hearing old-timey music with no identifiable source, and feeling an inexplicable sense of calm and protection near the house. The story of the quinceañera who danced with 13 dead men was never officially recorded, but it lives on in community whispers as a reminder that some family secrets transcend generations, and that true love can build bridges not even death can destroy.